All right, so let's go ahead and start fetching all of the earthquakes from our API. So let's go ahead and create here private request queue, okay, and say queue. We need this for our volley library to be able to queue up all of our requests as we add them, okay? And so the first thing we need to do right away, we're gonna go ahead and instantiate our queue. I'm gonna say volley dot new request and pass this, and we're done. And right away I'm gonna go and say the following. I'm gonna say get earthquakes. Okay, that's a method we haven't created, so which we will going to create right now. Doesn't need to return anything. I don't know why it did that, but we just changed it. Instantiate a JSON object request. So we're gonna say JSON. So JSON object request. Call this JSON object request. New JSON object request, and we have to pass in a method. So we're gonna say request dot method dot get, because that's what we need to do. Then we have to pass in the URL. Well, we know the URL is it's actually inside of our static constants there. So we're gonna say constants. Make sure our constants are, oops, we made them private. They have to be public, otherwise we're not gonna be able to access them. All right. So constants dot, there we go, URL. The next thing is gonna say new listener. Okay, let's go ahead and add new error listener. And we are going to finish our statement. And before we forget, I'm gonna add this to our volley queue. Okay, it's gonna be JSON object, just like that, request object. Perfect. So now here we have our response, which will be a JSON object, which incidentally will be this whole response here, all of this. So we know that the top tree here is just an object, which means this response here, again, is holding this whole response. So we know that, but what we need is actually these features with JSON array object here. So we need to fetch that. But for that, as you know, we have to construct our logic. We're gonna say JSON array, because we know this response here has the whole object. So we know we can now get to our array by getting our response. So we're gonna say JSON array. We can call this JSON array. Let's call it features is equal to response, right? Dot get JSON array. I'm gonna pass the string, which is features. Okay, like that. So we need to add a try and catch because we could fail here. That's good. So now that we have our features, that means we have all of these features, all of these objects inside of this array. So the next thing we need to do, of course, is to get our properties object for each item in this array of objects. Okay. So next, once we have that, so what we need to do, we need to go through that array. So we're going to say for int I is equal to 0, I is less than. So normally we would say less than features dot length. I don't want to do that because as you can see, we have 1,1942 entries, objects here. That's a lot. So that's the reason why we have the limit here. Okay, so I'm going to use that. So I'm going to say, instead of saying the features array that length, I'm just going to pass in our constants dot limit, right? If it's I is less than 30, we're going to go and say I plus plus. So that will just limit us for us to get at least 30 earthquakes, which is more than manageable. A JSON property object. So JSON object, we're going to call this properties. Okay, I'm going to set to features because that's the main array that get JSON. And we pass I. But we haven't got the features. All we did here is get this first object here. Only then when we get the first object inside of our JSON array, we have this JSON object, only then we will be able to get the actual properties object. So what we're going to do here, instead of stopping here, we're going to say dot get JSON object, and then we can pass properties. Okay, that's very important, and it can be a little bit confusing. So you always have to study and look closely, understand this, right? Because we have JSON array, we got it, but right immediately we have an object for each index. So index 0, we have an object, which in return, that object inside of that object has another object called properties, which is the one that we're very interested in because that's the one that has all of the other fields that we need to get information. So now that we have our properties here, we can just be happy. Let's go ahead and say log. Let's log, say properties dot get string. What can we get? So property, let's get place. Okay. Say place, and we should be good. Let's go ahead and run this, and we're going to open our logs. And as you can see, we are golden. We are golden because we're able to get all of our places, locations where earthquake occurred. Good. Okay, so we don't need this anymore. Get rid of that. So the next thing we need to do here, because we need other things too, obviously. So inside of our properties object here, we can get whatever we want. So we are good there. But there's something else we need to get, which is very important. In this case is the coordinates. Now look at this. So the coordinates is inside another object inside of our properties object. Actually, it's outside of our property object, is at the top, at the first level of the object here. Okay. So we need to be able to get to this object geometry and get inside of our coordinates JSON array object here to get our longitude and latitude. Okay. All right. So let's do that. So we were able to get the properties. If we were able to get the properties, now we have to go back one level, get to back this object here, immediate object, and get our geometry. Okay. So let's do that. How do we get our geometry object? Well, we know it's a JSON object, so we're going to say JSON object. Let's call it geometry, and I like to give meaningful names so that way I know. So we're going to go ahead and say features, this top here, features. If you go back, so we're going back to features, and we're going to get the object here. Okay, so we're going to say features dot get JSON object. We're going to pass the index, and we're going to say get JSON object, and we're going to pass in geometry. So again, remember, we went back to features, and we say, hey, go get that object. Which object is this object here at the top? Okay, because we have these curly brackets, that's the object. So we're going back because we want to get to JSON to geometry object. And then we say get JSON geometry object. There we go. So now we have our geometry object. Now we need to be able to get this JSON array here. Well, what are we going to do? So say get coordinates array. I'm going to say JSON array coordinates is equal to, of course, geometry, because that's the parent object here, dot get JSON, and we're going to say, we're going to pass the name. It's going to be coordinates. Make sure I got it the right name. Yep, that's coordinates. Perfect. And since it's an array, so we have lat and longitude. So what we're going to do here is do the following. We're going to create two variables. You can say double longitude is equal to, now we have in our coordinates array, so you can say coordinates dot get double index 0. For coordinates 0, the first item, it's going to be our longitude. Okay, like that. And so double lat coordinates dot get double, and we're going to pass 1. Okay, so now we got our longitude and our latitude. We don't need this. I think this has got to be altitude or something, but we don't need that. With this information, we can actually create an object. And just to make sure that we're actually getting that, let's say log again.d, say place, say quake. I'm going to pass longitude. I'm going to say latitude. Like that. Let's run this, see. And there we go. So we're getting all of our longitude and latitude. Okay, so now that we have this, you know what we can do? We can now start putting all of these into a marker and then into a map. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next video. I'll see you in a bit.